So some of the differences is that Hmong folks tend to think of symptoms in more physical. So I hear a lot of folks who come in and they have anxiety, but it's very hard for me to diagnose them with anxiety because they first talk about and so I'm thinking, oh, some physical illness, doctor. But as I'm talking to them more and I'm talking about, well, were you thinking about something during that time? Were you panicked about something? And some of them still have a really hard time identifying their cognitions related to what triggered that, possibly anxiety attack. But oftentimes I have to really pull it from them because they really think that it's something wrong with their body. That's why their whole body becomes cold. That's why they feel numbness and tingling, and that's why they feel like they want to die because they can't catch their breath. And we know that when people have a panic attack, they can't breathe. Because and it's all psychological. I can't breathe because, again, once you start becoming anxious and you start having worries that are just too overwhelming for you, your heart starts to beat faster because our body responds with our mind because the mind and the body are attached. And so your heart starts beating faster, and then you start hyperventilating. And the more you hyperventilate, guess what? The more lightheaded you become, the more you feel like you're going to die. But that's not what Hmong people think about. They think about their body is really going to shut down. They're really going to die. And so it's really hard for me, again, to diagnose them with some of these, through some of these Western lenses when they're speaking using Hmong terminologies. Also, I think what's the difference is that in our culture, we focus so much on the interdependence piece of it. And so oftentimes, I'm doing something for you in hopes that you would reciprocate that. And it's just part of the culture. We all depend on one another, not in a overly dependent way, but in a very healthy way. It's how we worked for generations, is that we value families, we value extended families, and we value clans. Whereas in the Western culture, I'm first. I have to go to college for myself, because if I don't go for myself, I'm going to lose motivation. I'm going to drop out. So you know what? Okay, some kids say I go to college because my parents are telling me to go to college. I don't really want to go. Some of those kids don't really thrive in college because it's not for them, because they're functioning in this Western culture. But folks who really are doing it for themselves and say, I'm doing this to better myself so that I can better my family, those are the ones that really do better because, again, they're caught in two worlds, and so they're thinking more individualistically. Now, in the 80s, you have college-bound folks who are probably more in the collectivist or the interdependent piece of it, and so that motivation for them would work in terms of going to college. It's like, oh, and so then that's motivation for them. Right now, a lot of younger folks don't really look at that. It's like, oh, gosh, that's so silly, and so they really don't care so much about that. And so those are the two drastic differences that I'm going to touch on a few slides from now, just to see how that pertains to mental health. And it's also that sense of responsibility. So when you look at Hmong mothers who are very depressed, most of them don't really let on that they're depressed, because they have this sense of responsibility that it's their role to be a good mom. And to be a good mom is to put aside my needs and to cook for the family, to clean for the family, and to make sure my kids are, clothed and all of these things. And so oftentimes people will say, well, you know that your mom is very depressed. And you're like, what? She's fine to me, because it's that culture. It's that whole culture that really says your needs are secondary to your family's needs, because now your role as a mother is primary, versus in the Western culture, hey, my needs are first. If I can't take care of myself, how can I take care of my kids? If I can't take care of myself, how can I take care of my relatives? So those are also very different. Time is also different in that time is shared. So, we often joke Hmong time, right? When you go to some kind of a Hmong feast, it's like, oh, because you always think, okay, you gotta wait for everybody. Oh, right? And so you wait for everybody to come because you want to share that time. Whereas in Western culture, it's like time is money. I gotta go somewhere else. So if people aren't here, gotta let them know I got some other thing on my book that I gotta go to. Control. This is a big one because this also affects our mental health. And that in the Hmong culture, we often think that when we're born with a visa, right? Like you young more ít ảnh tử lần thôi you na bây giờ. And so if someone dies very young, oh nó ảnh tử yên lo lên tử. Or if someone even commits suicide, they'll say, oh, I mean, there's a lot of different reasonings for it. Some of it is though, do not that of course, but most of it is that though, and so oftentimes when people become very depressed, they often think, yeah, you mong, yeah, you đàn đỡ gì, bột chơi you lúc năng gì, sọ nhảy lên nói, yên lên nói gì, or ý shit lúc năng nói. Whereas in Western culture, it's like, no, I can change what I don't like about my life. If I'm in this rut, if I can't find a job, I can change that by getting help somewhere else, by going to college, by reaching out to something else. And so that it takes on a very different feel in both cultures. And then the communication style is also very different. I mean, those of us who grew up in the United States are not embarrassed to have eye contact or just say exactly how I feel. I'm mad at you, I'm mad at you. Whereas in the Hmong culture, it's not like that. You tu share, you tu shin right? And so you have this very backdoors kind of approach and just beating around the bush approach. And so I just wanted to highlight that for you guys briefly so you have a sense of how that's different. Now the reality of life right now is that we don't live in these two separate worlds. We're not completely Western, we're not completely Hmong. And that some of the things that we used to do in the Hmong culture doesn't work anymore. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how mental health, mental illness is viewed in the Hmong community so you have an understanding of where folks who are not as Western come from. But at the same time, I also want to say that that's not where we live right now. That's not reality right now. It just helps us to understand where they're coming from so that we don't dismiss them as crazy, or so that we don't dismiss them as OG or as, HTT, but that we understand that wherever they're coming from, it's coming from a culture that they used to live in. But right now, again, the reality is that we have Western influences. And so we live in a society where our kids or our generation are thinking more Western. And that even the ways that we used to do things no longer works for us. Like, for example, well, you know what? We've got that mix of self-control in there too. And so you get a lot of different influences, like so you get a lot of people with different mindset. Whereas if you live in Laos or in Thailand, everybody has that same cultural perspective. And so and so everybody kind of supports that, right? And so now you've got some who say that, but you've got some who say the other things. And so like I said, what used to be effective is no longer effective.